Recently, I've been getting some requests to make some 90s boom bap beats. Now, there's a few different types we could make. We're just going to focus on a more kind of dark New York type sound. Composition-wise, these beats are fairly simple, but there's a few tips and tricks to get that sound. We'll dive into that today. Tempo-wise for this style, anywhere from about 80 to about 95 BPM works. So I'm just going to leave it set to my default 90. Element-wise for these kind of beats, it's mainly sample chops, drums, and a bass line. And that's pretty much all there is to it. But there's a few little things you can sprinkle in here and there as well. Now, sound selections are key to your drums here. When I'm looking for a snare, I'm looking for one that cuts through really nicely. Something like this. I'm just going to pull that in. I'm just going to find a couple of kick drums to go with it. I want something with a nice low sub-frequency that isn't too boomy in the higher end. Something like this one. I'm just going to layer that with the second one that has a slightly different tone to it as well. Something like this one. But something that's quite important with the drums to make sure they're not all on grid. You don't want them too far off the grid either so they sound out of place. I'll find something that works really well is to play them all in by hand and then just adjust them slightly. I don't want them perfectly on. We can just bring them a little bit closer. Much easier to adjust if you turn the grid off. Sometimes I like to take them just after as well. We will utilize the Ableton groove pull later just to get a bit more swing as well. Next, I think I'm actually just going to put a hi-hat down. So we're looking for quite a sharp, crispy hi-hat. Either of these ones are perfectly fine. Just go with this one. Key with the hi-hats is just to keep it really simple. Once again, we're just looking at taking them close to the grid. The first one I'll just place directly on the grid though, and the rest I'll just adjust close to it. Now that I've adjusted the timings, we're just going to adjust the velocity. But to make it feel a bit more human, we're just going to take this randomize down, maybe around 20 randomize. And we're just going to pull them down a little bit as well. And we're just going to duplicate that over using Control and D. Before I put the kick down, I just want to drop the volume on these slightly. Bring the hi-hat down a little bit. After putting the one kick in, we might switch up some hits for the second kick. We're just going to adjust the timings on the kick slightly first. Always like my first one to hit right on the grid. Now that I've got those adjusted, I'm just going to add some of the second kick, but I'm just going to use these as ghost notes. Maybe just one here. Bring the velocity down. Just a further one there. I'm just going to leave these ones on the grid and copy them over. Now that I'm hearing the kicks together, I'm not actually feeling the second one, so I'm just going to replace it with this one. Now to get a bit more groove and swing, we're going to use the Ableton's groove pull. There's one here called the Hip Hop NY Cut 16ths. I'm just going to bring that in. So without it, it sounds like this. And when you turn it on, it sounds like this. Makes quite a big difference. So now that I've got some basic drums down, I'm going to go ahead and find a sample to chop. We'll come back and process the drums in a little bit though. For boom bap, you can pretty much sample anything, but there are some genres that work better than others. So soul, jazz, classical are all really good choices. However, for this one, we're going to chop some medieval samples. So I found a pack on Spice called the Baroque Medieval Melodies. This has got some really nice pianos in it. I think when time stretched and pitched, some of these could make some really nice dark melodies. The one I'm going to pick today is this one. I'm just going to bring that in as an audio track. And make sure it's set here to complex. I'm just going to hold shift and drag it out to time stretch it to 8 bars. So the time stretching just already makes it feel a bit darker. I'm just going to add some strings to this and then re-record it as a sample so that the strings are in the sample for the chops. This gives a different feel to playing the strings over the chops as they're in there and they cut where the chops cut. I'm just going to go ahead and load Contact in. I'll load in the session strings too. So I know this sample's in D minor, so we're just going to play something along with that. Quite a nice easy scale to play. It's just D, E, F, G, A and B flat. Going to quantize these, leave the velocities natural, copy those over. I'm just going to duplicate this track, delete the MIDI clip, select spiccato. I'm just going to play a few more string hits in, then we'll process a few things and consolidate it into one sample. So again, I'm just going to quantize these, leave the velocities natural. I'm just going to balance the levels of the volumes. Let's remove some low end from the sample. Let's put the sample into mono as well. There's a lot of older samples were always in mono. Bring the volume level of this one down even further. So I want these to be in the background. We're just going to add some reverb. Take out the low end of these ones as well. Let's take some of the top off as well. Do that on the sample as well, I think. Now to get more of that sampled feel, we're just going to bring in some bite from Native Instruments on the sample. We just soloed it. And we're just going to select Classic Sampler. This is a bit crushing plugin, which helps give that kind of retro feel to things. I'm going to bring the mix down a little bit though. I'm also going to add some reverb to the sample itself. The reason why I want to add the reverb before I do the chops, so that the reverb cuts where the chops are as well. That just gives a slightly different feel. A lot of the time, if you're sampling from vinyl and things, you don't have a choice but to go with the reverb that's in there. Just a small amount. I'm just going to set both the sets of strings into mono as well. Now to consolidate the 3 tracks into one, I'm just going to insert an audio track. I'm going to select resampling, arm the track to record. I'm just going to mute these. I'm going to keep them there in a group, just in case I need them later on. Rename that as original sample. I'm just going to move it up to the top. Now just to show you what the sample sounds like with the drum loop before we cut it, here's how they sound together. Whilst they sound nice, I think it'll sound much better after we chop it. I'm just going to insert a MIDI track and bring in a simpler. What we have to do now is drag this down into the simpler. Let's just mute this track here. Come onto here and select slice. I'm going to select warp, leave it on complex. I'm going to set it to slice by beat. As I know I want this beat to sound a bit darker, I'm just going to transpose it down. This is just to get me a feeling, so I can play the sample chops in, and then I'll go and fine tune the transpose. I'm just going to go ahead and quantize all of these chops. So even though I like the sound of it here, I'm just going to play with this transpose by taking it back up to the original. I really like the original. I think here, just in between the two. Playing this solo, I can just hear some clicks and pops. So to eliminate that, we're just going to bring out the fade in a little bit. We're just going to bring out the fade out. Still a little bit there, so we're just going to bring out the fade out a little bit more. That's it now. I can't hear them anymore, so that's good. As we've pitched it down, some of the frequencies have come lower, so let's just take the low end out again. We're just going to filter out some of the high end as well. Let's add some more reverb. I'm just going to set this to piano verb. Next, I'm going to add some of Baby Audio's tape. This is one of my favorite tape effect plugins. I'm just going to set it to this preset here called Sample Pusher. Next, I'm going to bring in the Waves NLS channel stereo. This is an analog summing plugin, so it's just meant to make it sound like it's ran through the circuitry of an analog board. Just trying to give a bit of analog warmth to the sample. I'm actually just going to bring it before the reverb and stuff. I'm liking the way this is sounding now, so we're just going to go ahead and process some drums. A quick tip when using the Ableton drum rack, the easiest way to separate your channels so that you can process and structure them differently. If you rename all your drums, all you then have to do is right-click, click Extract Chains. This brings it onto its own channel. So when structuring the beat or processing the sounds, you can do them all separately. If you want to have two sounds in a group still to process them the same, all you have to do is highlight the two, right-click and hit Extract Chains. And then I can rename this to kick. And it makes a huge difference in the workflow, especially when structuring. I'm just going to start by setting the kick into mono. I'm going to set the snare into mono, but I'm going to leave the hi-hat in stereo. On the kick here, I'm just going to bring down some of the high end. And I'm just just going to cut everything below 20 hertz. The human hearing can't actually hear below 20 hertz, but sometimes I think it's the way it rounds off the sound down to 20. This does affect the sound. Now, if it does, I don't do it, but if I can get away with it, then I do. Doesn't need to be exact. I've just set it at 19 here. With the snare, I'm just going to take out the low end. I'm just going to filter some of the high end as well to get a darker sound on the snare. I don't want to filter out too much of it, but just a little bit. The hi-hat, I'll just make sure there's no low-end rumble in there. There isn't on this one. And just to give the hi-hat a slightly darker feel as well, we'll just filter some of the top. So this is before. This is after. The next thing I'm going to do is some parallel processing. The parallel processing in its simplest form is where you take one set of audio, duplicate it over to a second track, add a lot of processing to the second one, and then blend it back in with the original. The simplest form of this is your mix knob in your plugins, where it blends the wet and dry signals together. But for this, as I want to send multiple tracks to it, I'm going to insert a return track. Now in Ableton, when you insert a return track, it gives you this extra slider here. This is just how much of the dry signal you want to send to that track. Now on this one specifically, I'm going to send them all. I'm going to add some Dirt by Native Instruments. So even on the default setting, this makes a big difference. So for this one though, I'm just going to go with light and vintage. Next, I'm just going to add the glue compressor from Ableton. I don't mind this doing quite a bit of compression, so I'm just going to bring this threshold down. As we're not going to use it like this, we're just going to blend it back in. Next, I just want to add some reverb, but only to the hi-hats and snares. I'm just going to insert another return track. I'm going to send only the hi-hat and snare to it. For this one, I'm going to use the Lustrous Plates, and I'm just going to select the tight drums preset. Obviously, with a lot of the hip-hop genres like trap, we usually keep the drums quite dry, but for boom bap, this works really well. But what I like to do is bring the level up to where I can hear it, and then just back it down slightly. Obviously, we can hear this very loud at the moment. So what I'm going to do is drop the volume all the way down, and just start bringing it back up until I can hear it. Now that I can hear it quite prominently on the snare, I'm just going to drop it back down just a little bit. I'm just going to bump the EQ on my kick a little bit, just around 100 hertz. Next, I'm just going to add a little bit of smack attack to my kick. So for this type of beat, you don't need a super hard kick like drill or anything like that. So instead of adding attack like I usually do, I'm just going to bring a small amount off. A little bit more. I'm just going to add a little bit of sustain so that the tail of the kick doesn't get ducked. Now that I've got the drums sounding the way I like them, I'm just going to add a small amount more percussion. The key here is to not overdo it and just to keep it very simple. I'm just going to come back to this Havoc pack, go to the percussion and select the shaker. Now I'm going to use this almost like I would an open hat. So just before or just after the snare. Maybe just after this one. I'm going to randomize those like I would some hi-hats. Bring them down and drop the volume down. Next, I'm just going to find a crash to put at the start. Even though I'm trying to replicate a certain sound, I still want to put my signature into it. And that's something that I do in a lot of my own beats. So for this beat, I think rather than going for a big crash like this one, I'm going to go for this. It just fits the tone of the track a bit better. So as this is quite a quiet sound, I'm just going to bring the gain up by quite a bit. I'm just going to add it here at the start. And then I'll add another one here as well. So every 4-bar pattern it comes in. Drop the volume on the shaker. Next, I'm just going to extract them from the drum rack. I'm going to send these to the same effects as the other drums. So another good way for processing multiple channels is to group them all together. So if I just highlight all my drums, go to group tracks, and then rename that as drum bus. Then on the group itself, you can add effects. I'm just going to put another waves NLS on these. I'm just going to turn the drive up slightly. I'm just going to add a bass line next, and then maybe 1 or 2 more melodic instruments, and then it'll just be structuring it. Good options in boom bap beats for bass guitars, double bass or upright bass. For this style of beat, I'm just going to go to the Rickenbacker bass in Contact. I'm just going to select this dub bass preset. This has a real low sub element to it, while still sounding like a guitar. I'm just keeping the pattern really simple. I'm just going to quantize these. Put a small gap in here. Make this gap here slightly longer as well. I'm just going to sort the velocities out a little bit. Some are a little bit too strong. I want the human element, but not too much of it. Bring some of these up a little bit. I think that sounds better now, so I'm just going to select them all with Control and A. Duplicate them over with Control and D. And on this last one here, I'm just going to put an extra note, one further down, I think. I'm just going to drop the volume on the bass a little bit. And I'm just going to roll off any high end that might be coming through. I'm just going to do the same trick with 20 Hertz again. See if I can get away with it. As I know my kick's coming through at around 100 Hertz, I'm just going to drop there slightly. Make it a small cue. Just to further that a little bit, I'm going to add some sidechain compression. I'm still using kickstart like I normally do, which completely ducks the volume out of the way of the kick. This will just reduce it down a little bit. So I'm just going to use the stock glue compressor again. For a stock plugin, this thing's brilliant. I'm just going to expand it here. Click sidechain. Do the input from the kick. And I'm just going to bring the threshold down. Lastly, I'm just going to add a few melodic elements, nothing too big, maybe just some chops from other samples, but these will be small sprinkles, maybe just some strings. So I've gone ahead and I've found this sample from Splice. It's from the Ancient Ways pack and it's just a harp pluck. Now this is set in G sharp minor, so I've just transposed it up by 4. So when transposing in simpler, if you transpose it to the key of C, it'll correspond with the correct notes on the keyboard. So if you hit a C, it'll play a C. If you hit a D, it'll play a D, and so on. I'm just going to go and correct those. I'm going to start by quantizing them. And I think I'm just going to change this one down. I'm liking the way this sounds, so I'm just going to bring the velocities of these two notes down further. I just kind of want them to fade. These are only going to play in the chorus section just to provide some variation. Just going to EQ them. Select mono again. These I'm just going to add some RC20 to make them feel a bit more vintage. I'm going to bring the noise off. Next, I'm just going to add Saturation Knob from Softube. This is actually a free plugin and it's great. If we solo it. About there, I think. Almost doesn't sound like a harp pluck anymore. Lastly, I'm just going to bring some choral on these by Native Instruments. Bring the mix down a little bit. Then I'm going to grab the Waves NLS again. So another quick tip for Ableton, if you've got a few effects that you want to turn it on and off all at once, you can right click, hit group. This will just bring them into an audio effect rack. From there you can turn them off. So this is what we sounded like before. This is what it sounds like with the effects on. Just sounds a bit more old and vintage. At this point, I think I can safely get rid of these original tracks here. So lastly, I just want to add a violin just for the chorus section as well. For this, I've loaded in the solo violin from East West. I'm just going to leave the timings on these natural. We're just going to process them a little bit. Let's take out the low end again. Take off the high end. Turn them into mono. A little bit more high end back in actually. Let's add some reverb to these. This is the convolution reverb from Ableton. Just on its own without changing anything. It sounds great. So this is before. This is with it. It just helps put it in the background a bit more because it's not meant to be a focal point. So I'm just going to add the NLS again. I'm just going to add some bite from Native Instruments again. I'm going to select this one to old tape. Now before I go ahead and structure it, just to make the hat slightly less robotic, I'm going to select every second one. I'm just going to drop the velocities down below so it just goes hard, soft, hard, soft. I'm just going to grab them all again. I'm just going to randomize it by a very small amount. All that's left to do now is structure it out and show you the final beat. Before I do that, if you haven't hit that subscribe button already, you can press it just down below. And if you found any of the content here useful or helpful at all, please hit that like button. It all helps me grow on YouTube. So the beat's now structured. For this one, we've gone with an 8-bar intro into a 16-bar verse into an 8-bar chorus section. The only thing I've added is this reverse crash. This just takes us from the intro into the verse and from the verse into the chorus section. Apart from that, all I've done is some level changes. All the variation in this beat comes from dropping out the drums and changing up the instruments. For instance, the violin is only playing in the intro, the chorus, and this small section of the verse here. Some of these sections here, I just drop out the hi-hats, or drop out the kicks, or drop out the snares. This all leads to variation just to keep the beat moving along. So here's how the final beat sounds. Take it into the verse here. Create some variation with the drums. I think this has plenty of space for proper lyricists. Bring the violin in here. Into the chorus section here. I think this one turned out sick. Let me know what you think in the comments down below though. Once again, if you're new here and you haven't subscribed, feel free to hit that subscribe button down below. If you're looking for other boom bap videos, you can click up here. If you want to see me flip some cartoon themes, you can click up this side. Till next time, I've been SK.